I did a talk called How to Survive, which drew on my experience as a Boy Scout, which is if you're in unfamiliar terrain, if you are disoriented, if you're dehydrated, what do you do to survive? And I think that many of us went through that phase. We need to design our organizations for uncertainty, and being able to be more nimble and more flexible and agile as a matter of course, just because 2020 proved how uncertain life can be. But going through a near-death experience makes you stronger in the long run.
I think out of the pandemic, what you've seen is that the businesses who have been able to pivot their business model a bit or pivot how they do things and react in an agile way have been the most successful businesses. Don't leave yourself inflexible. Make sure that as new information comes in, you're able to react to them. So these black swan events that might only happen once a lifetime, it doesn't make sense to set your business up in case there's another pandemic, because that makes you inefficient. But it's a mindset that is then put into practice by the way that you set things up, the way that you set up your systems, the way that you choose your priorities, the way that you structure your teams.
A few years ago, people were saying, okay, do you know how to use Excel? Do you know how to use Word? Do you know how to use PowerPoint? In a few years, people will expect you to be able to use automation tools to digitize some of your manual repetitive work, because that's going to improve your productivity. And the pandemic has actually created a clear urgency that people had to go this way, because any business that is not designed to operate digitally would not succeed. We now learn to actually be far more in demand with our human capabilities in our future jobs, because the very repetitive, simple tasks are going to be taken over by software robots that we create and we control.
The pandemic has been very interesting, highlighting a lot of issues that many of us were aware of for some time, but they've really come to the fore. Black, minority, ethnic founders have really had ongoing challenges in accessing investment compared with their white and often male counterparts. And at the same time, where you live is a second challenge. Put those two together, and as a Black woman founder living in Leeds, that's an incredibly challenging issue for you to deal with. So we've had to really look at things from a different lens, and as investors make changes.
2020 showed us that even the most certain predictions can be eliminated by a problem that affects humanity. For every real entrepreneur, there is something at the very core of everything that we're doing, and this is the purpose. Why is it so significantly important for me to solve a certain problem? Right now, it is even more important to really think, what am I doing with my limited time on this planet?
For many investors in the pandemic, it's actually really changed their thinking, and they will build issues like social impact and sustainability into their investment thesis. So when you're an entrepreneur approaching investors right now, you need to really think how far you can show that you're going to make a really strong impact, either socially, environmentally, globally, that will really help you tune in to where investors are focused right now. So it won't be enough just to have a great technology. It's got to really have that wider and deeper sense of long-term impact. And I think that's really going to attract investment much more successfully in the year ahead.
We see a lot of businesses that have a very strong purpose-driven approach. And that really, I think, is going to be a lot of the future for global development. We had feared that COVID would derail us. In fact, businesses actually are embracing the Sustainable Development Goals as an opportunity. Because of the disruption that we're going through, there are many opportunities opening up here for social entrepreneurs with the right business model, with the right outreach, with the right thinking around how to leverage digital technologies in a better way. We need a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity in those spaces. It doesn't need to be a trade-off between profit and doing good. It actually can be both.
On the space station, you realize how interconnected we all are and how interconnected we are with our environment. When I look at what's happening around the world, is shaking people up to realize that when a problem happens in Wuhan, it impacts the entire world. It can bring large economies to their knees. And this time was a virus. Next time it could be something different, climate change, for example. So let's not just be naive and let's do something now. From everything we've learned, I see more people talking about long-term thinking because they don't want to deal with something like this again.
We have the opportunity to create businesses which follow a new set of rules. What we've given up to a certain extent is our wellness, as we're being invaded by too much news, too much information, too many demands on our time, and being able to step back and say, that doesn't contribute to my wellness. What does is having the time to go for a walk and to switch off. How do we build companies which take people's need for that lifestyle into account? How do we design jobs which don't infringe on our physical and mental wellness? And that to me is the essence of build back better.
Welcome everyone to the panel on the journey to net zero, where we'll be discussing all things related to moving the world to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. I'm Jack Dickens, an MBA student at Saïd Business School at Oxford, and I'll be moderating. To all the participants, feel free to use the chat and Q&A to engage, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can with a Q&A session that'll happen with about 15 minutes left in this hour discussion. We have a fantastic group of panelists today that I'm really excited about. We have Shaunagh Duncan, Lead Sustainability Manager of Bulb, Anna Alex, co-founder of Planetly, and David Koranyi, Sustainability Advisor for the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I'd like to start by allowing all the panelists to briefly talk a bit more about their background, what they're doing in the space, and ask what they think of when they think of the path to net zero, especially in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we'll start with Shaunagh, if Shaunagh doesn't mind. Sorry, Shaunagh, we're actually having a little bit of trouble hearing you. Why don't we move over to Anna for the time being?
Sure. I hope you can hear me well. Happy to introduce myself. So my name is Anna Alex, and I'm the founder of Planetly. At Planetly, we made it our mission to actually make sustainability reporting easy for businesses and make it scalable by this. And we want to enable business leaders to really take the right decisions going forward when it comes to the climate. So we automated as much as possible of the carbon accounting process based on the raw data in the company. And Planetly already is my second business. I founded another business 10 years ago in the fashion industry, so a completely different space. And while I was still working there, I already pledged in an initiative where I committed to become carbon neutral as a person and with a company. And that made me realize how manual the carbon accounting process actually today is. So there was like a consultant with the Excel sheet coming in, ask us a lot of data. And I was like wondering, why don't we use the best technology that we do have at hand to not report, to report for our sustainability KPIs as well, and not just use the best technology when it comes to all other KPIs that we're tracking. So this is exactly now what we made our mission at Planetly, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you a lot, Anna. And let's move over to David.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you to Oxford and the Saïd Center. It's a great pleasure to participate in this discussion. It's a little early here in New York City, so bear with me as I am still waking up. I just wanted to make one thing clear. You mentioned my UN capacity as an advisor, which is indeed true, but I wanted to emphasize that I'm speaking today not in that capacity, but as an Atlantic Council Senior Fellow for Energy Diplomacy, in order to be able to speak more freely about these issues. So when I think about the journey to net zero, what I often think about is an aspect that is quite overlooked in the global conversation, which is the geopolitical impact of the energy transformation. You see, energy transitions tend to be watershed events in history. And in the past, what we have seen is that they had profound and far-reaching geopolitical ramifications. If you think about the 18th and the 19th centuries, the shift from wood to coal fueled the rise of capitalism, nationalism, and even the imperial ambitions of European colonial powers. And in the early 20th century, as we have seen the switch from coal to oil, at least as far as transportation fuel is concerned, that was followed by a century of geopolitical turmoil in the Middle East. So I would argue that we are approaching a similar, if not more cathartic transformation, which will likely have major impact on the geopolitical landscape in the 21st century. And I'll be happy to talk about that more in detail later.
Thank you very much, David. Let's try again with Shaunagh, if that's all right, and see if it works.
Let me see. Do you want to give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Okay, fantastic. Sorry about that, everyone. I'm back. So yeah, my name is Shaunagh. I head up sustainability at Bulb. We are a renewable energy supplier, supplying 1.7 million homes in the UK, in France, Spain, and in Texas in the USA, which, as you can imagine, has been an interesting couple of weeks for us on that front. So for me, when I think about net zero, I really see it as it's our last chance to avoid a climate catastrophe. I personally believe in the power of businesses to transform, to tackle some of the world's most pressing issues. But this is really our moment. And importantly, it's an opportunity to get all parts of society together to act. And we've shown that we're capable of that. We've come together to respond to the acute crisis of the pandemic. So we know it's possible to do the same for the chronic crisis facing our climate. And really, we just need to get on and do it now.
Thanks very much, Shaunagh. And I think a great place to start would be go back to you, David, in talking about the geopolitics, because it's kind of the big picture, and then we can zoom in from there. Like you said, the energy transformation is a huge part of what's going to reshape geopolitics, and it's likely accelerated by COVID. So I'm kind of interested in hearing your thoughts on what the opportunities and threats are to geopolitical stability and in the way that the energy transformation will shape geopolitics in general.
Sure. Thank you, Jack. So let's start with the bright side first. So what we see is that the massive shift from fossil fuels to renewables is expected to have a largely positive impact on global stability. So if you look at most major economies, that certainly is the USA, China, Japan, EU, India, they will all benefit greatly by alleviating their import dependence and increasing their security of supply and decreasing their vulnerability to external suppliers. We also are expected to see with the reduction of the strategic importance of fossil fuels, it will also likely lead to the decrease in the threat of conflicts around hydrocarbon resources that has characterized very often the 20th century. We also see potentially the interconnected energy systems, electricity systems in particular, could create new interdependencies. And these interdependencies could lead to more regional and even global cooperation. And one of my favorite examples I like to use is that perhaps electricity collaboration in places like the Middle East could resemble what the coal and steel community was for the European integration in the mid-20th century. So it could start as a technical collaboration and spill over into other areas contributing to regional stability. We also expect renewables empowering hundreds of millions in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia, still without access to basic electricity. And that could in turn mitigate the migratory pressures on Europe and other more developed countries that could also contribute to stability. And then last but not least, on the positive side, we expect the shift to renewable energy to lead to a decentralized and democratized energy system within countries as well. So it's not just between countries. And this will allow new actors such as ordinary citizens, entrepreneurs, and cities to define energy policies and markets in a much bigger way. Now, on the dark side, what keeps me awake at night, if I may, is that the energy transition will also likely cause a fair amount of geopolitical upheaval. And the biggest risk in my mind is the potential instability in fossil fuel producing states. So if you look at the Middle East, North Africa, many countries within the former Soviet Union, on average, these regions have a net fossil fuel export of more than a quarter of their GDP. And a decline in fossil fuel rents has the potential to profoundly destabilize these countries and regions. And what we have seen, even though the writing is on the wall for quite some time, the vast majority of these economies are not prepared for the transition. If you look at Russia, which is in many ways probably potentially the biggest threat, if you think about what happened in the 1980s and to what extent low oil prices back then contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in many ways we could be in a rerun with that scenario. 40% of Russia's fiscal revenues are still connected to fossil fuels, or oil and gas primarily. If you look at Saudi Arabia, the break-even budget price for Saudi is about $78 US. Oil prices are well below that these days. If you look at what has been happening in Venezuela in the past couple of years, that's already a harbinger of what to come. So state collapse, ensuing mass migratory flows, conflict, even nuclear proliferation are all risks that are associated with this. And then a second, just very briefly, to put this on the table, is that what I see is that foreign and defense ministries around the world are increasingly recognizing that climate change is also acting as a threat multiplier, and that potentially will lead to more conflict and dislocation in many parts of the world. So those are the two major risks.
Thanks very much, David. And I guess as a follow-up question, I'm curious what you think about where companies fit into this, how they're capitalizing on threats and opportunities, and how they'll shape the landscape.
So there is one very interesting aspect with regard to companies, and that is the trajectory of IOCs and NOCs, international oil companies, or as they like to call themselves, integrated oil companies these days, and national oil companies even more. And to me, one of the most interesting questions is to what extent these companies are willing and able to transition and transform themselves to become companies that could compete in a 21st century setting, and what's the timeline for that transformation. There has been a lot of debate publicly and internally within these companies as well in terms of how fast they should transform. And what I see is that COVID and the last 1 year and the transformation induced by that is acting as a catalyst for those conversations. We have seen BP announced that they view 2019 as the year for peak oil, which is absolutely revolutionary. Most oil companies, all oil companies, in fact, put peak oil well in the 2020s or 2030s even. Now there is increasing discussion about whether we are past peak oil already. And to me, the battle for the soul for these companies, I see an enormously helpful role for these companies, the incumbents in the energy transformation. They have the assets, they have the knowledge to a large extent. They have the financial firepower to help and accelerate the transformation. So my pitch would be to, instead of vilifying these companies very often in public, we should try to push them into playing a more constructive role in the energy transformation that is well within reach for them.
Thank you very much, David. And I think that's a great time to transition over to Anna and Shaunagh, who I'm sure are thinking about kind of these big picture things and how their companies can move to address it. And I'm curious what they think they see around companies doing that in general, as well as their own companies. So maybe we can start with Anna to discuss what her company is thinking and how she sees the landscape in general.
Yes, thanks. I'm happy to take over this. I think for many, many years, we've been actually thinking that politics will solve or save us and will solve the climate crisis, but basically, and that it is on the politics to move the needle here. But if we look at the numbers, I mean, we all know we have the common goal of 1.5 degree and limit the global warming to below 1.5 degree. But if I look at the current measures that politics has taken, I'm now speaking for the German politics here, we are rather targeting a 2.6 degree scenario. So there is a huge gap of 1.1 degree, which is not covered by any political actions and measures that are taken currently. So I think we need to be very clear here. Of course, politics has a huge lever and they need to pull this in the years ahead, but still there's such a big gap. This needs to be filled by businesses and by companies because they do have an extremely big lever as well. And this is exactly what we see, and we see an increasing number of businesses understanding this responsibility and wanting to step up their game here, wanting to understand their carbon emissions, their carbon footprint, want to really reduce it and offset what can't be reduced. And there's a huge momentum in the business world towards that. And I do believe it is important to mention here that businesses are not just acting now because they are such nice people and such good humans and understood this responsibility, but because climate action actually today became a business case for businesses. There's a lot of upside potential for businesses to act now. So the first and foremost that we see in our daily work with our customers is to strengthen the employer brand in the war of talent, being carbon neutral and having a good sustainability strategy is definitely extremely important. The second, the consumer brand, but as well for business, B2B businesses, as well there. Microsoft, for example, announced only in future only to work with carbon neutral suppliers, right? This is a strong statement. And I think as well, like when it comes to financing and to investors are increasingly taking sustainable companies and carbon neutral company or carbon neutral. Let's put it like this: I guess they are taking carbon neutrality as a proxy for good running, well-run businesses. So if the business leaders are taking this path now, they will have like all other threats on their mind as well that can occur for the businesses in the years ahead. So I do think it's important to say it's not just because the companies should act, but because it makes sense for them to act.
Thanks, Anna. And moving over to Shaunagh, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely echo all of that. I mean, we're increasingly seeing the business and the investment case for this sort of net zero ambition. I mean, businesses in all sectors, in all parts of the world are recognizing that. Even in the face of the pandemic, we saw commitments to net zero double in the last year alone. And we can only expect that trend to continue as we have COP26 coming up later this year. And I think, again, echoing some of those thoughts, we definitely recognize at Bulb, there is a role for government in this, and we're doing a lot of work on that. I think the key thing for us at Bulb is that green needs to be affordable, and that makes it inclusive. And so the government does have a role in putting those policies in place to make greener choices for people more affordable. So an example of that, we recently asked the Chancellor to scrap VAT on green products in next week's budget. So that will include things like electric chargers, heat pumps, home batteries, and again, making green choices affordable for millions of families. But of course, the businesses need to take part of that too. And I think what's interesting for us is the how. We're seeing a lot of ambition, but I think what we're noticing is that whilst companies are recognizing that they need to act, they're struggling with how to actually go about doing that. And so one of the things that we like to do at Bulb, and engaging with our, not just our members, but the businesses that we supply as well, is creating an easy framework for business to go about this. And this will resonate with you, Anna, with the work you do at Planetly, but sort of 3 really simple steps that businesses can take, which is to, number 1, the most important part is to be measuring your carbon emissions in the first place. And it's quite noticeable how few companies even fall at that first hurdle, and they get overwhelmed with how to do it. But it's quite simple that you can't really go about understanding what you need to reduce in your supply chain unless you measure those emissions first. So that's always the number 1 thing to do. And we've started doing that at Bulb and reporting on those emissions publicly. And then of course, number 2, as we've discussed already, setting targets to reduce those emissions in a way that's backed up by the science. So this 1.5 degree target, and then making your business accountable to that, to some external body, or publicly reporting so that you are transparent about the impacts you have on the planet and how that's going to change over time as we reach a net zero world. So we're certainly seeing businesses starting to understand their role in that and the importance of that. And yeah, like I say, I really hope and expect that trend to continue as we move up to in the lead up to COP26 this year.
Jack, can I jump in just briefly on that subject as well?
Please, that would be great. Thank you.
Perfect. So now agreeing fully with what Anna and Shaunagh said about the role of the private sector, that's indeed the case. I mean, if you look at SDG 7, the sustainable energy goal of the UN, that will require about $1.2 to $1.4 trillion of investment every year up until 2030 to make good on that. And the vast majority of those sums will need to come from the private sector. But I would argue that government policy is key, exactly along the lines of what Shaunagh just said about making green energy even more affordable. And there are 3 steps that governments need to take urgently to level that playing field and make green energy more affordable. One is phase out coal subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies in general, especially oil and gas, and introduce carbon pricing, which will go a long way to making renewable energy technologies even more affordable and sustainable.
Thanks for adding that, David. And I think I do have a follow-up question for you as well. You talked about the policy that government has to think about. I'm also curious what you think about the relationship between government and companies and what that relationship needs to look like in order to meet these objectives.
Generally speaking, it should be an enabling environment that the government creates. And I think first and foremost, and Anna from the private sector will back me up on this, like a predictable investment environment and a regulatory framework that encourages and supports and ensures the security of investments is probably the most important. So that private sector participants can plan for the long term and invest their money, knowing that they will have a stable regulatory and political environment to look at. And that's easier said than done. And unfortunately, what we have seen is a lot of policy experimentation, understandably so in the last 10 years or so. But to create and then not change, ideally, all the time, these policy environments and regulatory environments is probably the most critical piece of the puzzle.
Thanks, David. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about investment in the energy sector and for companies pursuing sustainable objectives. Venture capital has shifted away from energy-oriented hardware and maybe shifted more towards energy-oriented software. I'm curious how you see this impacting the entrepreneurial landscape and innovation in the renewable energy sector. And I'd ask Shaunagh to weigh in a bit on this, if she wouldn't mind.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jack. Yeah, as you say, there's a lot of change happening in the energy sector right now. And And I think Bulb is a good example of that. When Bulb started 5 years ago, only 1% of UK homes were with a green tariff, and now that figure's 30%. So that gives you a sense of the scale of growth there. And I think crucially, as we've talked about this theme of being able to demonstrate that being green doesn't cost more, and technology being a really key part of that. So for example, at Bulb, we have a team that helps us lead that transition, and 30% of our staff are in technology related roles, and we're still hiring for those. And I think in 2019, the UK received about £300 million of venture capital investment into companies like us using technology to help to reach net zero, which I think was a 30% increase from the year before. So I think that goes to show that green technology startups and growth companies are going to be really crucial in reaching the UK's quite ambitious net zero target by 2050.
Thanks. And Anna, would you mind weighing in as well?
Yeah, sure. I was already unmuting myself. So I do believe as well that climate tech is a huge business opportunity, and startups in this field will be very, very important to really make progress here and challenge the big companies even more. So we're really stepping up our game. I think most of us have seen this is a sentence: sustainability is the new digital, and I think this is it very well represents this big business opportunity that is there. So I can only encourage even more entrepreneurs, and we do already see a big inflow of entrepreneurial talent into this space, which is absolutely great, I must say. Yeah, so I do believe it's really both, and we've seen this in the introduction, and I very much can relate to this. So I'm calling us at Planetly as well a for-purpose, for-profit company. So we're combining both, and because in the end, impact for me is always the equation of having a purpose and scale. So you can have the best purpose in the world, without scaling it, you won't have impact. And in order to scale, it's good to use venture capital money. It's good to have some money at hand to afford hiring the best talent in tech and in sales and so on to make the companies really big. So I think my recipe going forward will be really the combination of that. And I do believe we are at the beginning of a huge new wave actually of companies, and a whole new generation of companies who are doing exactly that, who are combining purpose and profit with, and will be the leading companies of the future.
Thanks, Anna. I think it's a good time maybe to shift over to something David said about not vilifying larger companies, and rather than vilifying them, pushing on them to make energy transformation. I'm curious how you feel you can get them to be more innovative, as well as how you see smaller companies like we're discussing now fitting into the picture.
Thank you, Jack. It's a great question. So I see already tremendous developments with regard to IOCs and some NOCs as well. I mean, Equinor is one of the best examples, and Norwegian sort of NOC IOC hybrid that recognized relatively early on that offshore oil and gas platform technology is not that much dissimilar to offshore wind technology. So they're leveraging their existing technology base to transition parts of the company into an offshore wind operator. So that's quite encouraging. I mean, referring back to what I said about carbon pricing would be a way to be able to create that incentive system on the macro level to push these companies and incentivize these companies to invest more into clean energy would be a way to go. Decreasing fossil fuel subsidies on the other side would have the same effect. So those would be the two most important policy tools. I also wanted to flag something that I find very important, which is the role of governments in clean energy R&D. And again, agreeing with Anna and Shaunagh about the role of the private sector. But at the same time, as far as basic research is concerned, and as far as potential breakthrough technologies are concerned, governments still have a major role to play. And initiatives such as Mission Innovation that was launched at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015, collaboration between companies and governments will be key to accelerate the clean energy transition. If you look at what the International Energy Agency says about whether we have the breakthrough energy technologies necessary to implement the energy transformation on a timely manner to reach the 1.5 Celsius target and net zero by 2050, the answer is a resounding no, unfortunately. So in order to get there, we need breakthroughs in clean energy, R&D, and research, and governments are essential for that.
Thanks, David. Really appreciate it. I think we focused a lot kind of on companies that are directly addressing energy in the climate crisis, but I'm also curious to get some perspective on companies that might not be directly addressing the challenge, but also are trying to reduce their emissions, particularly scope 3 emissions. So what they're doing to try and find the big levers there to reduce their carbon footprint. Anna, it would be great if you could talk a little bit about what scope 3 emissions are and what companies can do to address those. Thanks.
Sure. I'm happy to take this. So there are standards for carbon accounting as there are standards for financial accounting. And it is very important that companies are following these carbon accounting standards. The most important one is called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Standards. And we're strictly working alongside that. And it is separating the emissions into scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. The scope 1 emissions are your direct emissions that are emitted, let's say, from your company vehicles, for example. The scope 2 emissions are all emissions from electricity that you're using in your business. And then scope 3 emissions is everything else. So it is all emissions that are your indirect emissions from service providers. For example, if you take the plane, the emissions of this plane will be scope 3 emissions. It will be only your indirect emissions. But still, of course, you do have a big responsibility and lever here, which service providers to choose. So actually the biggest part of emissions in most companies are in the scope 3. So all logistics emissions, because most of the companies are working with service providers on that side. Most production, because they're working with suppliers, which are all indirect emissions, but still it is super important for the company to understand these scope 3 emissions, and because they are the big chunk and the biggest lever they have here. But they are at the same time the most complex ones, because you need to get all the data together and really understand which factory is doing what. So, and this is exactly where we at Planetly see the big potential of technology to make this easy for businesses to understand the big levers in the whole supply chain and then work with your suppliers to reduce this.
Thanks, Anna. And I'd like to shift the question over to Shaunagh to hear how her company is addressing scope 3 emissions and what she thinks about them in general.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Yeah, as Anna says, scope 3, certainly for Bulb and with all other companies I ever speak to, always the largest, most complicated bulk of emissions where the most of their emissions are happening. And that's certainly the case for Bulb. So for us, it's all about decarbonizing heat. So we supply 100% renewable electricity. The emissions and the impact on that front are relatively low. And then, we have natural gas with some green gas that we supply to our members. What's interesting about that is really the sort of challenge that the UK has on decarbonising heat as a whole. So there's only enough green gas in the UK to reach about 1% of total UK demand. And as we've already talked about, other heating solutions that are low carbon, like heat pumps, things like that, just aren't scaled and certainly aren't affordable right now. And so, you know, we have to supply quite a lot of natural gas to keep our members' homes warm. And of course, that comes with a carbon footprint. And so whilst we do what we can and are continuing to do more and more engagement with government, bulb alone can't solve the problem of decarbonising UK heat. And David, you were talking earlier about sort of lots of different policy that has never quite come together. And I think taking carbon out of heat in the UK is certainly an example of that. Policymakers have yet to pick a path, and that's really delayed a lot of the action that we could have had on taking carbon out of heating in the UK. And so we offset the carbon emissions from the natural gas we supply by supporting carbon reduction projects around the world to balance out that carbon impact. But for Bulb, we've set our own net zero target by 2030. And so for us, it will be all about decarbonising heat. That's the bulk of our scope 3 emissions. And like I say, it's going to involve a lot of collaboration, helping our members use less gas in the first place through new tools and products, new technologies, but also, as I say, engaging with government to help the wider UK context as well. So it'll be a challenge, but worth doing, of course.
Thanks, Shaunagh. I'd like to shift it over then to David, who can maybe talk about Scope 3 emissions in the public sphere. How are governments thinking about Scope 3 emissions, and maybe how should they be thinking about Scope 3 emissions?
Let me actually just echo what Shaunagh said about the importance of focusing on other end-use sectors than electricity, which is quite critical. If you look at decarbonization in the electricity sector, that has progressed quite far. And if you look at the last 5-6 years, the majority of investments in the electricity space went into modern renewable energy and hydro. So the match and sort of the competitive landscape in that realm is heavily favoring renewables because they are cost competitive, even without subsidies in most places in the world. But that didn't happen in the other end-use sectors, such as heat, as Shaunagh was emphasizing. So it is critical to, while of course recognizing that we have made tremendous progress in the electricity sector, also recognizing that only constitutes a minority of emissions, and focus more on the other end-use sectors, such as heat, cooling, which is an increasingly important area as well, and transportation and others.
Great, thanks, David. I think now is a great time to move over to some of the questions coming into us from participants watching this. And so I think I can start with one of the questions here, which is towards Anna. It says, "Hi, Anna, thanks for speaking today. There seems to be no single widely accepted set of industry standards for verifying the integrity of carbon offset projects. What are some of the discrepancies you're seeing in these standards?"
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a great question. There are standards, which are, for example, the gold standard or the verified carbon standard, VCS. And what they are verifying is that the carbon was really avoided by the projects, and it has already been avoided in the past. So most of these are really like looking back. So you can be sure whenever you purchase these that you really have an impact here on the climate. Plus, what these standards are validating is that the criteria of additionality is met. What that means is that the projects aren't profitable per se, but they need the money of the offsetting money, in order to pursue their actions. From our perspective, this is good already, but I do believe that in future we will be seeing a shift from carbon avoidance projects more towards carbon removal projects. So it's not just I'm avoiding that further carbon dioxide is blown into the air, for example, with cook stove projects, which are like some of the very most popular projects among that. But as well, how can I really make sure to get the carbon out of the air that is already there? There are great, like already technical solutions which are not really yet available at scale, but hopefully will be over the next years. And I do believe we will see a shift towards that, and we will see as well new standards and certifications around these carbon removal projects going forward.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to think about carbon mitigation of emissions versus carbon removal. I'm curious, David, what's happening in the public sphere for carbon removal?
Actually quite interesting, because for a very long period of time, in most policy circles, the carbon removal conversation was taboo. And the argument was that if you talk too much about carbon removal, then we will alleviate the pressures on carbon mitigation. And now in the last 2 years or so, I see this conversation coming up quite heavily in policy circles. The recognition that we are very late in the timeline as far as net zero to 2050 is concerned, the pressure to mitigate as much as 40% of carbon emissions by 2030. So the number of pathways that will get us to net zero by 2050 based on where we are today are diminishing. So there's an increasing recognition in policy circles that carbon removal needs to be on the table and needs to be discussed.
Yeah, that's great. I think with the pressure that's coming, carbon removal is going to become increasingly important. I'd love to shift the next question over for Shaunagh, and the question is, in your opinion, what is the nature and extent of the responsibility of entrepreneurs in the developing world to empower and support the net zero journey in the developing world? My concern is that inequality in this journey is vast and worsening.
Really interesting question. If I may as well, just add something to the previous question on the carbon removals before I get to that. So I think one thing that was really great to see was the UK government recognising and recently releasing a call for evidence on the need for carbon removals. And I think that's quite a strong signal, the recognition that, agreeing with the climate science that, as Anna and David just said, we need to be going beyond just emissions reductions. We need to actually be taking carbon out of the atmosphere. So I've got some quite high hopes for the UK government's role in that as well. It'll be really interesting to see the response from that latest call for evidence later in the spring. But onto that question, the role of entrepreneurship, particularly in the developing world, have I recalled that question correctly?
Yes, the role of entrepreneurship and the inequality that might be worsening as a result of the lack of or the entrepreneurship in the space.
Yeah, so I think I know I've been talking a lot about the importance of the sort of transition being an affordable one, but as we know, it also needs to be a just one. And I think this is where a framework like the UN Sustainable Development Goals come in really nicely, because we talk, it's easy to slip into a world where we talk a lot about carbon, a lot about greenhouse gas when we think about, transitioning towards a net zero world. But we also need to recognize that those actions and those changes don't operate in a vacuum, and we need to consider the wider socio-economic context of these things, particularly if we're talking about carbon removals projects, carbon offset projects, etc. And that's where the UN SDG framework can come in really well. And I think the role of a private sector or any sort of anyone really funding those types of projects or these types of transitions need to recognize that they have a duty of care almost to be going beyond just saving carbon, and what contributions can they make towards those other sustainable development goals, including gender equality, poverty alleviation, also more sort of nature-based things like protecting biodiversity. And I think that framework is, I mean, I've personally seen a lot of companies recognizing the UN SDGs even in the last year, whether that's related to the pandemic or not, who knows. But I think, yeah, it's absolutely critical that we are considering all those elements of a sustainable and just transition and not just thinking about the emissions.
Thanks, Shaunagh. And I know, David, you mentioned this almost as a place for opportunity, in that the energy transformation will be democratizing, and that it gives basic access to electricity to places that don't have it. So I'm curious for you to weigh in on whether or not you see a trend towards greater inequality because of the energy transformation, or if you see it as a way for things to become more equal, and what needs to happen for it to become more equal versus creating greater inequality.
I think in the long run, it will lead to a more equal situation. It's a question about how we manage the transition. What we have seen in the last year, for example, there's been enormous progress, fortunately, in the last 10 years towards providing basic electricity access for the still about 800+ million people in mostly sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. But that progress in the last 1 year stopped. So we have a duty to refocus our efforts to provide electricity to those, again, government policy and international organizations, and support enabling frameworks, financial flows as well, but mostly creating the right environment for entrepreneurs and companies to invest are the most critical. Now, just referring back to what Shaunagh said about the role of entrepreneurship and the SDGs, I have seen so many inspiring examples of young and particularly female entrepreneurs in this space, in electricity access, in clean cooking, in clean energy finance as well, across both Africa and Southeast Asia. That it's quite inspiring. So that's good news. But again, refocusing our efforts and ensuring that the repercussions of the pandemic will not halt that process of providing electricity to those most in need is going to be critical.
Thanks, David. Anna, do you have anything to add?
I do believe that in future it will be as common for business leaders to talk about their sustainability KPIs as it is today to talk about the financial KPIs. And I do believe as well that this will include as well some more like social KPIs going forward, not just the environmental, but as well the social and the governance aspects as well. So I think it's extremely crucial that we, are all like calculating along the same lines and on the same standards there, so that you can really benchmark yourself versus other companies in all regards. And then I'm very optimistic that we all together can really move the needle here.
Yeah, can I just add briefly one more aspect to the inequality conversation, or two, in fact. One is that it's actually quite interesting that in the renewable space, how ownership is shaping up. For example, in Germany, which is at the forefront of the energy transition in many respects, you see that there is 31.5% of installed renewable energy capacity in regular private citizens' hands. So there are these cooperatives. So it's just a fundamental shift in terms of how the energy sector is owned and managed and profited from. And if we see this replicated in other parts of the world, that's going to be quite encouraging. And the second aspect in terms of inequality and the just transition, we mentioned is going to be also as quite critical in terms of compensating is probably not the right word to use, but alleviating the pressures on the losers of the transition is going to be key. And it will be key from a political perspective, because it will enable policymakers to assuage certain constituents who could be quite powerful in their lobbying effort to slow down or hamper the energy transition. And it will also be fair to communities who are devastated by the closing of coal mines, for example, in Poland or in the United States. And it will also be actually much cheaper to compensate the losers with early retirement and other schemes that could go a long way in accelerating the energy transition and diminishing fossil fuels in our supply.
Thanks, David. And we have about 9 minutes left, and so before we begin wrapping up, I think we had a good question come in because we've kind of gone along in this conversation with climate change as a given, but the person was asking, what would you say to someone who doesn't believe in climate change? And so I'll pose this question to all of our panelists, and we can start with Anna.
Yeah, so I've been thinking quite a lot about that in the very beginning at Planetly, and what we decided for ourselves is to never go onto the moral level and never really say you should, you didn't in the past, and so on and so forth, because in the moment that you're doing this, you're putting yourself higher versus the person you're talking to. And I think this holds true not just like for business conversations or in business relationships, but as well in personal conversations. So I don't believe in that putting yourself onto a higher moral level, but I rather believe in basically saying from here on going forward, what can we change? How can we stay constructive? How can we stay positive? How can we stay optimistic? Plus always referring to facts that are there will be probably my best advice on that.
Thanks, Anna. And I'll pose the question to Shaunagh.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Because this used to be something that came up a lot. Certainly my experience in the earlier days, you'd have to start conversations on the premise that maybe someone didn't believe in the climate crisis. And now, thankfully, that's changing a bit. But it is worth reminding yourself that these conversations still need to be had. And for me, this is really, again, where entrepreneurs in the private sector can play a really important role when they're either thinking about their business proposition or whatever it is, because I think it's important that you can offer a benefit to your customers beyond green. So if it's, let's say you're a plant-based food brand, your sort of number one selling point may be nutrition and health. Or if you're bulb, the number one thing we sell is affordability. And then the green is a nice, almost an afterthought. And then it doesn't matter if the person or the customer does not believe in the climate crisis, because they are getting a benefit from your product with or without that. And then you're able to widen your audience and widen your reach by not, as Anna's saying, we want to avoid pushing an agenda or shoving, net zero and the climate crisis down people's throats, because, that can really turn people off. So I think if you're able to present that co-benefit beyond just the green thing, then that's where we're seeing companies and entrepreneurs, that's the winning formula for me, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, is bringing some benefit outside of just the green benefit itself in order to get buy-in. And David, if you'd like to weigh in, that'd be great.
I mean, exactly along these lines, and agreeing wholly with everything what Anna and Shaunagh said. And the scientific consensus is absolutely overwhelming, but let's discount that for a second. And my two arguments usually, one is, and especially in the last 1 year, we have witnessed this, like how gorgeous it is to live in major cities without the air pollution. So think about that aspect and how much more livable these cities become. So even if we completely discount climate change, air pollution and the number of deaths it causes on a yearly basis and the illnesses it leads to, in and of itself would be a good argument to act. And the second, along the lines of what Anna and Shaunagh were talking about, just the quality of the products. I mean, if I only think about electric vehicles, they are faster, they accelerate better, they are less stinky, they are beautiful, they are beautifully designed, and soon they will probably be cheaper as compared to internal combustion engines as well. This is still some way off. Battery prices are coming down, but that's well within reach in the next few years to be on par or even cheaper. So why would you buy, I argue, a BlackBerry in 2021, 2022 when you could buy a state-of-the-art iPhone, which is just fulfills every need you have in a much better way?
Thanks, David. That's great. We have about 4 minutes left, so I think now is a good time to begin wrapping up the session. To the attendees, please rate the session at the end. You can make appointments with other attendees in the event platform, and you can visit some of our exhibitors because we have a 1-hour break. And then following that, there's at 1 p.m., there's going to be a lunchtime keynote with Sheila, Lirio, Marcelo. So to wrap up the session, I'd love to just get closing remarks from each of our panelists. And Shaunagh, if you wouldn't mind starting, that would be fantastic.
Yes, of course. Well, firstly, this has been a really, really great session. So thank you for organising it. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves why we're all here, the need to not go back to business as usual after the pandemic, and to use this as the confidence and the optimism we need that, like, when we need to solve problems, we can do it. And just for everyone to bear that in mind in whatever capacity you're working in. And this is such a great opportunity for a green recovery with COP26 coming up. Let's just keep talking about it, sharing our experiences and coming together to collaborate. Because, the one thing we do know is that no one's going to be able to solve the climate crisis on their own. So we're going to need input from as many people as possible. So keep talking, keep collaborating, and good luck.
Thanks, Shaunagh. Over to you, Anna.
Yeah, I do believe it is really a unique point in time where so many extremely talented people are all working towards the same goal. And we're all united in this goal because we all want for us and our children and children of children a livable planet. And this is just like great to basically feel this every day. And as Shaunagh said, so collaboration there, really communicating, taking your standpoint is key. And I'm extremely excited to see what the next years will bring.
Thank you, Anna, and over to you, David.
Thank you, Jack. So in closing, I would argue that the geopolitical conversation is going to be critical. And I think COVID in many ways served as a wake-up call. There was a false sense of security before in terms of what the timeline could look like, and there's going to be a long decline in fossil fuels, which will now, it seems, could be more abrupt. And that, coupled with the pressures of climate change and the security risks that entails, we will really have to step up our game and ensure that we both reap the benefits of the energy transformation and mitigate the risks that are involved.
Thanks a lot, David. I really appreciate it. And I think a big takeaway for me is that it's going to be a collaborative process that needs momentum from both public and private sphere, and we all need to participate to reach ambitious goals. So this officially marks the end of the session. I just want to say thank you to all the panelists for their time and great insight. And thank you for being a part of this. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.